بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Today we continue the station of Tabatul, isolation. And just as a review, last week we spoke about how the isolation, or what's meant by the isolation here, is the spiritual isolation, where the heart isolates itself from depending and being overly attached to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And today we will discuss the three levels of Tabatul, and we will start with Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala, who says وهو على ثلاث درجات. الدرجة الأولى تجريد الانقطاع عن الحظوظ واللحوظ إلى العالم خوفا ورجاء أو مبالاة بحسم الرجاء بالرضا وقطع الخوف بالتسليم ورفض المبالاة بشهود الحقيقة. This is quite amazing. We really pay attention to this. I mean, everything that's being said in this book is very relevant to us as individuals and is applicable to our situation. And that's why this book is so powerful. I mean, it's a seminal book. It's a seminal work because, the author and Ibn Qayyim's depiction or his explanation of the words of the author are so impactful that regardless of who you are, where you are, or what your iman status is, I mean, there's still something, there's always something for you to benefit from. So the first level of isolation is tajreed al-inqita' an al-hudud, is to cut yourself off from your self-gain and looking at yourself, or from self-gain and from the attention of the creation. And again, I'll explain this inshallah as we go. Out of fear and hope, meaning in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or out of being heedless to the realities of the world, meaning heedless to the opinion of people of you, or to people's opinion of you. And that is done by using hope, or cutting off your hope in this life with, or using your it's so hard to translate. And we do this by cutting off our hope in this life using the tool of Allah's pleasure, and cutting our fear with submission and refusing ورفض المبالاة بشهود الحقيقة. And I don't even know how to translate it, so I'm just going to go ahead and explain once we get there. So at Tabatul, when we talk about isolation, there are two goals at play here. Remember, isolating the heart. How is that done? It's done by doing two things. Al-ittisal wal-infisal. By attachment and disattachment. Attachment to Allah and disattaching yourself from yourself or from the world. So al-infisal huwa inqita'u al-qalbi an hudud al-nafs wa muzahamatin al-muzahama li murad al-rabb fihi. So disconnection, what's meant by this is disconnecting yourself or disconnecting your heart from your own personal gains. Your own personal gains, not all of them, but a specific type of personal gain. The personal gain that will rival your pursuit of what Allah wants from you. That will challenge your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we've spoken about this before. So Tabatul essentially is disconnecting your heart from anything that poses a threat or a challenge to your connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Also, disconnecting your heart from looking at other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, whenever you need something, you don't look to other than Allah for it. Whenever you are challenged with something, you don't look to other than Allah for the solution. When you are struggling with something, you don't look to other than Allah for help. again, do not conflate what's obligatory upon us in terms of taking the proper means in order to reach a certain result. Do not conflict that with our seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help. These aren't contradictory things, but rather they work together. So it's about reaching out to Allah for help in finding the solutions and doing what you need to do in order to come to a particular result. And also recognizing that the means which you are using to reach a result are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the first place. So for example, if someone is struggling with, for example, bad health due to overweight, or bad eating habits, I should say, right? They have a loss of energy, their sleep is disoriented, whenever they walk, it's very painful and tiring for them. That is the result of poor eating habits, we'll say. Okay, I want to get rid of that. This is a challenge, I need to deal with it. How am I going to deal with it? Well, we start off by seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help, right? Number two, we recognize that taking care of the body is part of Iman. It's part of our responsibilities. Something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has tasked us with, according to the Prophet ﷺ. So we need to realize that our pursuit of greater health is not simply because it is beneficial to me, but rather poor health weakens my own ability to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone with poor health will struggle praying, for example. Will struggle with doing something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is let's say a event that requires physical activity, helping the homeless, for example. And you have to be outside, it's a little bit hotter, and there's a lot of walking involved. Now someone who's overweight might feel discouraged to do that because of their weight issue. Now that is, their weight has become a barrier between them and doing something that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when they take the decision to deal with that and to have better eating habits and health habits, they're doing that because there is something spiritual about it, right? And it's not just because I'm doing this because I want people to see me as a beautiful and gorgeous individual. I want to attract people, which is probably the main reason, primary reason why people, especially younger people, focus on their health. Teenagers, when they start working out, all these guys, and beefing their muscles, etc., most of the times because they want to attract girls or they want to feel cool, etc. So spiritually, that's not the goal here. So we are isolating the heart from self-gain, a particular self-gain that will challenge our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or pose a threat to it. Also, a personal gain that seeks to draw people's attention to the individual, right? So Tabatul is trying to remove these two things, is working to remove these two things to where when we do something, it's an effort to attach our hearts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that much more. And we do this, and this motivation is fueled by our fear of Allah and our hope in Him. So when we fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we become concerned with our intention. Intentions, as the Prophet ﷺ is one of the major tests of this ummah, because the Prophet ﷺ said that the thing I fear most for my ummah is ar-riya, ostentation, where people do things for other than the sake of Allah. They do things that are outwardly spiritual for non-spiritual reasons, for personal gain. So this is something the Muslim takes to heart, and it creates an amount of fear, and it creates an amount of doubt in the individual's ability. So I doubt my sincerity. That is part of Iman. And the more a person questions their sincerity, the more likely that they are sincere. But the less a person questions their sincerity, the less likely they are to be sincere. Right? So we do this, we isolate our hearts from these factors, these variables, out of fear of Allah, that this will lead to a negative consequence. It will lead to my good deeds, my efforts being nullified. It will lead to a moment in the next life where I will be looking at a mountain of good deeds that will dissipate, that will become dust and dirt, because all of it was done ostentatiously. That is something that arouses fear. At the same time, fear is something that fuels our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we've spoken about before. I believe we went over the station of fear. So fear is something that bothers us, and because we are bothered by it, it kind of pushes us towards something better. Because we are afraid of something, we take precautions against it. This is human behavior. We are afraid of a robber, and therefore we lock our doors. And for example, if you are in your bed and you don't remember if you lock the doors or not, or if the doors are locked, that will bother you. You won't be able to go to sleep. It's just on your mind until it pushes you to get out of bed and check to make sure the doors are locked. So that type of fear is actually very positive. We are afraid for our future, and therefore we build investments. We have an investment. We are afraid for the future of our children, and therefore we educate them. Right? So this is a very positive fear. So out of fear is something that fuels our connection to Allah. And fear is something that fuels our motivation to disconnect our hearts from ourselves and our worldly gains. Worldly gains that, again, that contradict or challenge or threat our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So fear is one element that fuels the disconnection aspect here. Likewise, hope, raja, hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I hope that by disconnecting my heart, isolating my heart from these personal gains that are problematic spiritually speaking, I hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts my efforts because I am hopeful in the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, I am hopeful that what Allah offers me in replace of this isolation is far more pleasing to me than what I would gain if I pursued it. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Qasas, in the context of Qarun was a very, very wealthy man. He was of the children of Israel at the time. And his wealth, was something, as we are today, when we see someone who's very wealthy, it brings an amount of awe, an amount of jealousy. I wish I had that much wealth. There's an amount of coolness that comes with wealth. Someone who's very wealthy is automatically revered by society. So if you are wealthy, you have a platform in society, right? Any society, not just today's society. That's just how it is, because we are attracted to wealth, because wealth brings a lot of worldly pleasures, etc. So the scholars of that time advising the believers of that time who have been mesmerized by the wealth of Qarun, the scholars said, ثَوَابُ اللَّهِ خَيْرٌ لِمَنْ آمَنَ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا. They told the believers, the reward of Allah is better for those who do good deeds, right, and believe. Now, what most people will derive from this statement is that the reward of Allah in the next life is better than having all this wealth. And that is true. But there is a second element to it that tends to pass people by without them realizing it, or people they don't catch on to it. And that is that the reward of Allah is not limited to the next life. In this life is reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah rewards us in this life, and there are tens of evidences that support that. And one example of that, whoever is good whoever enjoys ties of kin, ties of kin, and they check up on their relatives, etc., then Allah, the Prophet ﷺ says that Allah will put blessing in their life and blessing in their wealth. That is a worldly reward. That does not negate an afterworldly reward, right? But rather there's two here. That's a different topic. I don't want to go in too much of a tangent there. So Allah does reward us in this life. So what these scholars are telling the children of Israel, the believers then, is that when you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the reward and the pleasure that you get out of that in this life exceeds and is greater than the pleasure and the satisfaction that comes with wealth. So when a person is wealthy, there's a type of satisfaction, gratification that comes with that. I'm wealthy, I could do what I want. I could go on any vacation that I want. First class, 5-star hotels in the prime locations. You know, that's great. I mean, that brings satisfaction, that brings gratification, and that brings pleasure, a good feeling. What the scholars are saying is that when you worship Allah in salah and in fasting and in dhikr, is satisfaction and gratification that's more pleasurable, that brings more pleasure to the individual than what wealth can do. So that's part of the thawab of Allah, the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this raja, this hope in Allah, when we isolate our hearts, when we disconnect it from worldly pleasures that threaten our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is that hope that's fueling this isolation, and there's hope that's fueling the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أو مبالاة به أو فكرا فيه بحيث يشغل قلبه عن الله. Right? So that's the idea here. And again, I just want to stress and emphasize what we are isolating our hearts from, what we're disconnecting our hearts from, are things that threaten our relationship with Allah. Whether it's something that is forbidden, or something that is discouraged, or something that is permissible, but it has this problematic aspect to it. Like the example I always give, and that's TV. A lot of what's on TV is permissible. A lot of it is not permissible. Okay, but for that is permissible, then there is a concern, a fear that we will be losing out on a lot of more pleasurable things when we dedicate our time to television instead of that. وَالْإِتِّصَالُ, as for the connection to Allah, then this connection, this attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes after the disconnection. This is what Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah is saying. So in order to be connected to Allah, we need to disconnect our hearts from these things that challenge our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the first place. And subhanAllah, what you find in the lives of many people who end up accepting Islam, or who build their Islam, their Iman, is that they go through a type of phase before accepting Islam. And a lot of times that phase is very difficult upon them. It is a time of stress and a time of anxiety. And essentially what that does is it breaks the person's attachment, or even before that, it starts to bring thoughts to the person's mind that question and challenge the structure of their life in the first place. And it shows that the structure lacks integrity, and it is weakened, and it fails, and it eventually collapses. And then the person now needs to rebuild. So, for example, one individual I knew who was one individual I know actually who was a Christian and not too practicing, but an event happened in their life where they became more interested in Christianity, and they started to study Christianity a little bit more, and at the same time they studied Islam. And what they found, this individual, he's really an interesting guy. He's younger, and inshallah there's a bright future for him in da'wah because he has the capacity. Basically, the Quran began to deconstruct certain presumptions that he had before it started to reconstruct him. I hope I'm being clear here. So it's very common that the person is deconstructed before they're reconstructed. And for us Muslims today, your generation, the generation, what's called the immigrant generation, or even beyond that, the previous generation, the previous two generations, in fact, their challenge was colonialism. And colonialism brought a certain mental construct that was new, and the scholars nor society, Muslim society, had experience with it. And that construct really creates a lot of difficulties, challenges when it comes to understanding the Quran. For my generation and Generation Z, the one after me, their challenge is modernity and post-modernity. These are philosophical realities, or that life and society and politics are built off of today. And what you find is that for my generation, the previous one, even your generation to an extent, when they read the Quran, it's a lot more difficult for them to understand what's being said and what's meant by said than previous generations. And that is because there are certain ideas that have been introduced to society and are fundamental to modern day society that really hinders a person's, or puts them on a different mental understanding of the world than previous times. I can't see your reaction, so I don't know if this is all getting to you or if I'm just speaking nonsense here. Can someone confirm, let me know, are you following along?
Yeah, you're following. Thank you. And it makes, I can relate to it. Jazakallah.
Okay, so this is a reality here, and this is something I personally experienced. And to give it from my experience, when I was growing up, and more so when I started to seek knowledge, there was this thing that bothered me. And that is, there's a lot of things that are being said in the Quran that simply doesn't make sense to me. Not because I didn't understand what's being said. I just couldn't connect it to the reality I'm living in. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the natural world, and nature is something I talk about most. But before I reached this understanding, whenever Allah would talk about the sun and the moon, look at how Allah created the sun and moon. There was just nothing fascinating about that to me. When Allah talks about day and night, okay, day and night, we understand what day and night is. I couldn't understand why Allah is referring to these things that are so mundane to us. And it was later on, actually when I started the program at Bayn, where I started to realize the problem. And that is, when we look at the sun and the moon, and day and night, and the mountains, and the natural world around us, we look at these things from a purely scientific explanation. So the sun, if you were to ask someone, what is the sun? They will respond to you, the sun is a star, and it's a burning object of gas, or an object that's just burning with gas. And it will be depleted after X amount of years, however long it is. That is how the sun is defined. And although that is true, people cannot see beyond this reality, the scientific reality of it. Partly because they haven't been taught to, and partly because the construct of the world today does not care about that part. So if we have a scientific explanation to something, that somehow excludes a divine presence in that reality. Okay? That's the fallacy that has taken over the minds of people today, especially in the West, or primarily in the West. So this is the problem I was having. And it required a bit of contemplation and tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and really contemplating why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to these things, to realize that although there is a scientific explanation at hand that is correct, there's also a spiritual and a theological reality at play, and they go hand in hand. Okay? Now I went on a very long tangent. So what I needed to do in order to understand the Quran and be able to transform the natural world around me to something that connects me to Allah, I needed to disconnect my own mind from scientism. Okay, scientism is the notion that the world is explained in purely scientific terms, and there's nothing beyond science. If science explains it, that means there's no theological reality at play here. So I needed to recognize it and deconstruct the fallacies at hand in order to be able to connect, to make the connection between the natural world and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so this is what Ibn Qayyim is saying here. In order to connect, we need to disconnect. Now that is a complex example. There are also simple examples. In order to better connect yourself to Allah, there are certain characteristics that you need to disconnect from, such as arrogance. Someone who's arrogant will never have strong iman. They can't, because arrogance is about seeing the self as great. And so long as a person sees themselves as great, they will not see anything else as greater than them. And that will affect and impair their own ability to attach to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the greatest. The smaller a person sees themselves, the bigger they will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the bigger they see themselves, the smaller that they will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And some people's arrogance, they don't even realize that they're arrogant. Some people's arrogance will reach the extent where they are willing, they would rather adulterate and change the words of Allah than say, "Oh Allah, I have made a mistake, so forgive me." Let that sink for a moment, because there are a lot of people like that. Someone is engaged in a major sin, like they drink alcohol, and then you have this verse that says alcohol is forbidden. Instead of accepting that for what it is and saying, "Oh Allah, I made a sin, forgive me," they would rather write books and volumes of books and hours of debate to show that this verse does not prohibit alcohol. Right? They'd rather do that than say, "Oh Allah, I made a mistake and forgive me." Between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not even a public affair. They're not standing in front of everyone and humiliating themselves in front of everyone. It is between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is arrogance. If that arrogance is there, how are they going to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Likewise, feeling self-sufficient. This is another major spiritual problem that can lead to disbelief. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala points to people like Abu Jahl and wealthy people and he points to this istighna. They feel self-sufficient. I don't need God, right? I have everything. I have my wealth. I have my mind to take care of me. I can take care of myself. I don't need Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is a major spiritual problem. How are they going to connect to Allah when that's present? Right? They need to disconnect that in order to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, in behaviors. So this isn't a characteristic, but a behavior. There are certain, if we have poor time management or we waste our free time, then how are we going to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If I would rather watch a silly show or play silly games, which we're all guilty of, right? I understand. Again, this isn't something that's unethical, Islamically speaking, but let's be real with ourselves. If I would rather do these things, how am I going to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's become the problem. I need to disconnect myself from these things that waste my time in order to invest that time in connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so we're still in the first stage, disconnecting ourselves from things that challenge and threaten our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what's meant by the connection is the spiritual connection, the connection of the heart. How do we do that? How do we disconnect and connect? Now, again, this particular level is so powerful. May Allah have mercy on Ibn Qayyim and Abu Ismail for just their what they have left us with. And alhamdulillah, all praise to Allah that He taught them these things. How do we do it? And this part is so powerful that, again, it's so easy to apply, and we can apply it across the board, across life, subhanAllah. And that is, in order to engage in this disconnection and connection, we need to do three things. And that is utilizing hope, raja, cutting off our raja, our hope. In fact, the more precise word that's being used is shrinking, minimizing our hope in this life and in what other people have by using the tool of rida, of being pleased with the qadar of Allah and the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His law. Okay, what's going on here? Some things that challenge our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are, in fact, the primary thing that challenges our relationship to Allah is our desires. And that can include our desire for wealth, our desire for, materialism, our desire for the opposite gender, our desire for prestige, fame, our desire for praise. These are all things that threaten our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also, someone who's pursuing these things can easily fall into unethical and un-Islamic behavior. So, for example, in our time today, wealth, in order for someone to become wealthy in the capitalistic society, in fact, capitalism is really out of it, in a heavily interest-driven economy, they need a loan. It's rare for someone to be in a family wealthy enough to help them make investments while they are young. So most people have to resort to loans. I'm going to open a business and I'm going to do it by a loan, taking a loan from the bank, and then they fall into interest. Or they will enter certain investments that will bring them interest. So they benefit from interest. And that's the easiest way of making money. So their pursuit for wealth and their connection to this wealth can lead them to behaviors that disconnect them from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how do we deal with that? And that is by utilizing rida, pleasure or being pleased with what Allah has given us and with Allah's law. So when we are pleased with Allah's qadar, if I don't have an amount of wealth that I wish I had, I realize that this is what Allah has prescribed for me, or what Allah has dedicated for me or designated for me. Not to say that we don't pursue. Right? Again, please leave that out of it. This is a common mistake that people make. But let's say someone did work hard and they tried opening a business, didn't work out, or they tried getting a non-interest based loan, it didn't work out. As they try and work towards financial affluency, they remain pleased with what Allah's qadar is bringing for them. By doing that, it helps subdue and quench that desire for wealth and affluency. What Allah writes for me is better for me than what I want for myself. And therefore my pleasure, my rida with what Allah has given me is enough to subdue tendencies that might lead me away from Allah, might disconnect me from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, Allah has made certain things forbidden, and there are profound wisdoms behind that ruling. And although interest, for example, might be something that can lead me to financial affluency, I am more pleased with Allah's wisdom behind the prohibition than I am with becoming affluent in the long run. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So this is something that's very applicable to all parts of our lives, to all of us. It doesn't have to be this big of an idea. It could be smaller. For example, your husband. I'm not gonna say your husband. Let's say a lady has a husband, and her husband, isn't the smartest individual in business. Not bringing as much money as she would desire, right? So she doesn't view her situation as the result of his lack of competence, right? But rather, she starts to understand it from the lens of my pleasure in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And although that individual may have made mistakes or lost opportunities, by looking at that individual from the lens of Allah's pleasure, and I am pleased with Allah, she will start to extract the positives and the optimism behind that individual's presence in her life. As the Prophet ﷺ teaches us, that if there is something you don't like in your spouse, then there's something else you do like in your spouse. Meaning, no one is perfect. Every one of us has attributes in their spouse that they wish they didn't have, but they need to realize that there are attributes that they do like in their spouse and that is beneficial to them. Focus on those. So this comes from that pleasure in Allah and what Allah has written for me, the qadr. Again, this does not mean we sit back and relax and wait for the qadr to come to us. We pursue and we do what we need to do. When you marry your children off, you need to put in the proper effort to make sure that you are marrying your child off to someone who is good. And that's not based on our customs and our societal pressures, and right now in the context of race and all this stuff, just because the spouse or the individual who's coming to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage is darker in skin, and again, this is in the Arab world as well, by the way. But hopefully with these events, it will really collapse and die out. That somehow someone who is darker in skin, because that is viewed by society as being less beautiful, people won't marry off their children to darker color skin. People of darker skin color, not necessarily black. It'd be a very dark brown, right? So where was I going with this? I forgot where I was going with this. Well, by realizing that individual skin color is dark because Allah chose that color for that individual, and Allah is pleased with His own qadar and His own choices, then that rida, that pleasure with what Allah has chosen, helps remove that connection, this hope in other things that are the construct of societal beliefs. Okay? I hope that's clear. This is very important. The second thing is minimizing, reducing, shrinking our fear. Okay? Fear is another another emotion that impacts our behavior. Hope, aspiration impacts our behavior. Someone who aspires towards financial affluency will work. Young individuals who want to become wealthy will sacrifice their sleep. They will sacrifice relaxation. They will sacrifice their comfort in pursuit of wealth. That is the aspiration, the motivation, the ambition, and that impacts behavior. Likewise, fear is something that profoundly impacts behavior. So Trump is trying to use this. President Trump is trying to use this, instill fear in the people's heart. Alhamdulillah, Americans, by the way, coronavirus and the current protests, I don't know if you've noticed this. It has shown that humanity is still alive and well. Alive, well, and healthy. Humanness is still very much alive. Even though prior to this, many of us have complained that, human beings are just not the way they were. They don't care about anyone else. And now I'm starting to see advertisements on YouTube, commercials on YouTube, that's focused on encouraging people to call other people and check up on them. And apparently now there is a service where people will call people and just say, hey, my name is so-and-so, I'm just calling to check up on you. Are you okay? That is fantastic. That is phenomenal. And to be honest, we at OCIF, we need to make a system where we have volunteers who are consistently going to I think there are 2 nursing homes, senior homes in our area. I know there's one in Lake Forest and whatnot. We need to have a committee and a volunteering group that day in, day out, every day we send 2 or 3 people just to go there and sit with the people. How are you doing? Are you okay? To volunteer an hour or 2, every week or every 2 weeks. That's Islam. That's Islamic. That's something the Prophet ﷺ did. He visited the young man who was a Jew when he was sick and falling ill. Now, of course, the Prophet ﷺ utilized that for da'wah. And we can do it too. Go and show them what Islam is. We as Muslims, we care about all people. We care about those who society seems to care less about. So maybe we as this group can set something up in that regard. So fear is something that impacts our behavior. How do we as Muslims be in control of our fear? How do we shut our fear out from impacting our behavior, right? To where we filter out the negative elements of fear while holding on to the positive elements of fear. What's negative fear? Negative fear is fear that impacts our behavior in a way that disconnects us from Allah and or connects us to other than Allah. So someone can use fear to make us do certain things, right? Insurance companies are just the masterminds of this. Well, you might have an accident. What are you going to do then? What happens if you die early? What's going to happen to your kids? Right? They instill fear, legitimate fear in our hearts in order to impact our behavior and sign a contract with them. Now, although this isn't unethical, Islamically speaking, it's perfectly fine. Insurance, in my opinion, all forms of insurance are fine, including life insurance. But you can see how the fear is impacting our behavior, right? Other times it can be something that leads to haram things. I am afraid for my financial stability in the future, therefore I am going to take out interest-based loans in order to invest, etc. That can be out of fear, not just hope. So how do we deal with that? It's by taslim, submitting to Allah. Because the individual who fears for themselves has submitted themselves to what they fear. This is so beautiful. Really pay attention to this. When we fear something, we essentially submit ourselves to what we fear. So remember, as children, we used to be very afraid of our parents. And because of that fear, we would submit to what they tell us to do. Right? Nothing unethical about that. But just kind of to give you an example of what's being said here. If we fear, and I see this, for example, sometimes in couples. Someone is afraid of divorce. And anytime an argument occurs, the person, that fear is so aroused that they start behaving in very strange ways. Because now the person has submitted themselves to that fear. Right? So we as Muslims, in order to challenge that and to prevent it, when our fear is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we submit ourselves to Allah, thus liberating ourselves from fearing anything other than Allah. So people look at fear today very negatively. Oh, Allah tells us to fear Him. That's not good. That's bad. Where's the hope? Where's the optimism? Where's this? Allah Ghafur Rahim. Allah is all the benevolent, the all merciful, forgiving, etc. That's all true. But when we fear Allah, we no longer fear other than Him. When we fear Allah, the more we fear Allah, the more we submit to Him. And the more we submit to Him, the more we will liberate ourselves by not submitting to other than Him. Right? So we put our fear in check by fearing Allah. So this is such a beautiful, play on words, subhanAllah. And when we submit to Allah, essentially we put ourselves in the hands of Allah. We are saying, oh Allah, I fear you, therefore I submit to you. And I submit to you because I believe you will take care of me. I am hoping in what you promise us. And you promise those who submit to Him. Right? So really let that sink in. And whoever knows this, and whoever wants to build this fear and this recognition, just remember that everything is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. When He tells Musa to go to Fir'aun, right? Go to Fir'aun, Musa said, well, we're afraid. I'm guilty, or they accuse me of a crime. So I'm afraid that he's going to execute me under the notion of that crime, or because of that, what they accuse me of. What does Allah tell them? قَالَ لَا تَخَافَا إِنَّنِي مَعَكُمَا أَسْمَعُ وَأَرَى. Allah told them, do not be afraid, I am with you, I hear and I see everything. Right? In other words, as Ibn Kathir rahmatullah alayhi says that Allah is telling Musa, Fir'aun's forehead is in my hands, meaning he is under my authority. He cannot do anything except if I will it, and he cannot harm you except if I will it. So don't be afraid of Musa, don't be afraid of Fir'aun, be afraid of me. And subhanAllah, one of the miracles, just the most amazing and astonishing thing of that story is that despite, the more you think of this, the more amazing it looks. When you think, why did Allah allow the event to occur where Musa accidentally killed that soldier? It's as if Allah is showing us something. Despite all the factors and variables being against Musa, to the extent that even Fir'aun's legal system is against Musa. Musa is not, according to their legal system, an innocent man. He is a man guilty of a major crime. Despite all of these factors and all of the elements being against Musa and in favor of Fir'aun wasn't able to land a finger on Musa. And Allah is pointing this out. Don't be afraid of him. I am in control of everything. Subhanallah. So the more we are able to instill this perception in our minds and in our hearts, the more we are able to observe Allah's authority in the universe, and the more we are able to recognize that everything that occurs is by the permission of Allah and under His wisdom and based on His wisdom, the more we are able to fear Allah and submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and thus liberate ourselves from other than Him. A few verses in this regard. قُلِ ادْعُوا شُرَكَاءَكُمْ ثُمَّ كِيدُونِي فَلَا تُنظِرُونَ إِنَّ وَلِيِّيَ اللَّهُ الَّذِي نَزَّلَ الْكِتَابَ وَهُوَ يَتَوَلَّى الصَّالِحِينَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet ﷺ to go to Quraysh. Tell them the following. Invite and call and invoke those that you worship besides Allah, and make a plot against me. So get all of these gods who you claim are supernatural and super powerful, all of you together, come up with a plot against me. And don't wait. Meaning, don't give me time to prepare. Don't give me time to fortify myself. Don't give me time to leave. Immediately, you and all of your deities that you claim are super powerful and capable of striking me, come together and plot against me. Right? And know that my guardian is Allah, the one who takes care of the righteous people. In other words, The argument is as follows. Your claim, O pagans, is that these entities are super powerful and that's why you worship them. And by being super powerful, that includes their ability to strike me and to stop me. So I'm telling you, have them stop me. But if they don't stop me, that indicates one of two things: that they are under authority of a greater being who is supporting me, or that your claim that these entities are super powerful is false in the first place, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or Ibn Qayyim, is using this verse to drive the point of fear and submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the second verse that's here is قَالَ إِنِّي. You know what, I'm not going to go there because for the sake of time I just want to finish this level. And the final thing is subduing al-mubalat bin nas. Hold on, let me refresh my mind on this. Okay, is by minimizing our concern with other people. Meaning that we are not concerned with other people's opinion of us, nor are we concerned with what other people consider to be proper, if that which they consider to be proper contradicts Islam. Okay? And so basically we are no longer shackled by social opinion, and we are no longer shackled by what other people are going to think of us. Again, this is not general. This is referring to that which contradicts Islamic ethics and principles, right? And the way we free ourselves from those shackles is by recognizing that everything is from Allah and under His authority and His sovereignty. So why should we care about what other people think of us and what pleases other people when we observe this reality, this theological reality? Okay, so this is always a challenge in societies. Every society has its customs and its social pressures, and in America we suffer from this as well. You know, a lot of people shy away from an Islamic look because it's strange according to society, or it's weird and we don't dress this way, right? People will shy away from certain Islamic topics, like what goes on in paradise and the bodily pleasures and rewards in paradise. They'll say, oh, look how silly this is, and that becomes a social pressure. And even the Prophet ﷺ, this was a challenge for him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala documents this in the Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us how to get over that. And that is recognizing that everything is under the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, we shouldn't be concerned with that pressure. So we do away with the pressures of society which impact our behavior by recognizing Allah's authority, and that should be the pressure that's on us, right? So this level helps us do away with certain emotions and mental constructs that impact our behavior in a way that connects us to other than Allah, or disconnects us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So social pressures forces us to connect ourselves with the waves of society and the path of society, which can and does often disconnect us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah ta'ala alam, I hope that was clear, because this is very, very important for us. Remember, free yourself from aspiring or being overly connected to what this world can offer us by where is this? By being pleased with what Allah has given us. So battle connection to this life with pleasure in what Allah has given us and has ruled. Free yourself from the shackles of fear by submitting yourself to Allah, and free yourselves from social pressures by observing Allah's authority in the universe. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum.